Well, happy Quarantine Tuesday. I wanted to record and release and post a video in lieu of having some connectional weirdness that I'm experiencing at home where I am. So what I thought I'd do is I'd put out a video, but also I would like to have a few points in this video where I'll ask you to kind of pause and reflect on something and hopefully you might have some kind of text or word processor in front of you where you can kind of like jot down a few lines of how you might respond to certain kinds of prompts that I want to ask you as we discuss virtue ethics, right? So, okay, the first thing I'd like for you to think about, and pausing the video, is this question about what exactly it means for something or someone to be good. So think about the meaning of the word good. It's not something that we've talked a whole lot about. We're kind of like taking a step back a little bit and talking a little bit more theoretically about what's kind of been in the backdrop of a lot of our conversations. So reflect a little bit about what it means to be for something to be good. And the sky's the limit. Just do a brainstorm and pause the video now. Okay, so hopefully you've thought about your concept of goodness or what somebody's possible definition of good might be. So here we can talk a little bit about how virtue ethicists might think about the good. Previously, one of the reasons why virtue ethics takes a significantly different approach to ethics is that it's no longer really very interested in laws or even really principles. We're not really thinking in that sort of framework anymore with virtue ethics. Instead, we're thinking a little bit more about being or approach or, as we'll see soon enough, character. Right? So, all right. So if we think about what it means for something to be good, we can just approach it colloquially. I'm curious about what some of your understandings of it are, and I'm gonna, when I open up the discussion for today, for today's discussion, I'd love for you to put your responses to these prompts in the videos, just pop that into the discussion, and that way I'll be able to kind of see how you were able to follow along in the video. So your first prompt would be, what's your understanding of what the good is? All right, so Aristotle's understanding of good, and many of our understandings of good, really, the way we use the word colloquially, just kind of in ordinary language, if we refer to something as good, we mean that it's effective at fulfilling its purpose. And what I mean by that is, you could think of innumerable examples. Is the computer you're using right now a good computer? Right? If it's a good computer, then what you mean usually when you say that it's a good computer is that it does what it's supposed to do. It does what it's designed to do, right? And it's good at doing what it's designed to do. It's effective. It's efficient or whatever. If you think about something being a good tree, that could mean a number of different things, but again, it's going to have to do with purpose, right? So if it's a good tree for, well, my wife and I, for example, we're thinking about where could we like, is it possible to put up a hammock, right, in our backyard or something like that, right? Well, uh, we don't really have any trees that are good for that, right? Good for that purpose. However, we do have some good trees that are good for other things. They're good because they're beautiful, they grow, they're strong, or whatever. Usually, there are attributes that are associated with goodness, and goodness is just like a general term that we use to kind of capture all of those different kinds of attributes that something is meant to have, right? Are those good golf clubs, right? Is is that a good dog? Who's a good dog, right? So okay, what do we mean by good dog? And of course, let's forward that up to, of course, what we need to talk about is what it means to be a good human being, right? So we have a sense of what it means to be a good tree, what it means to be a good baseball bat, what it means to be a good dog, or what it means to be a good human being, right? So when we think about goodness as a human, we oftentimes think about behavior or attitude or character, right? Personality. So what does it mean to be a good person? Usually we're talking about somebody, how somebody approaches other people. We're talking about attributes of of themselves. So this is quite different from thinking about laws or principles or rules. We're now talking about features of a person or features of a thing. So if we think a little bit further about that, um, virtue ethicists start to talk about well the virtues as how we might understand these attributes that are supposed to be good in a human being. All right, so virtue really comes from a word that kind of means strength, right? So if you are strong in certain areas, then that could be classified as a virtue. All right, so and here's another point where I'd like for you to pause the video and do a brainstorm for me. Just and this will just be like a series of words. I'd love for you to take a moment, pausing the video when I say pause, and draft a few words and just kind of like brainstorm a few virtues, things that you would consider virtuous attributes of a human. All right, and pause. And if you've unpaused, then hopefully you've written down some things that come out of your mind, some things that emerge from your mind, which are virtues of a human being. Some of you, oftentimes there's this phrase that we often use, patience is a virtue, right? We might say that compassion is a virtue, or that mindfulness or conscientiousness or awareness could be understood as a virtue. And classically, there are four cardinal virtues that we oftentimes talk about, and those include justice, prudence, as in like prudential wisdom, being kind of clever and crafty, and being kind of aware of how best to respond to certain situations. Moderation is another one of the four cardinal virtues, and finally, courage is another one of those virtues, right? Okay, so I'm gonna ask you to pause the video again pretty soon with this question: how do you think we identify these virtues? Because if we make a list, that list, has the risk of seeming maybe a little bit arbitrary, right? Where do these virtues come from? How do we figure out what they are, right? So pause the video and then maybe write another line or two about what you think is the origin of these virtues. How do we figure out what they are? Okay, and please pause. And we're back. If you paused, that may have worked. So the I'm curious again. Please put in the discussion how what you came up with. Like how it is that you kind of derive or figure out what these virtues are. How do you identify these virtues? Um, One of the interesting approaches to this was developed by a very ancient philosopher about 2,300 plus years ago named Aristotle. Right? You've heard of Aristotle. We've chatted about him maybe a little bit, but see, he certainly developed um, in a fairly robust way a system of virtue ethics. And here's how he identifies what the virtues are. He takes this approach where he thinks about these extremes, right? And there are extreme behaviors that we can think about. Usually, at those extremes is something that is not optimal, something that we would consider a vice, something that is not a good trait of your character. So think about extremes, right? If you are, we'll go back to the virtue of patience, right? What happens if you have no patience, right? Where's the extreme there? And when you have no patience, then you're just eager to do everything, and there's no way that you can wait for anything, right? It just seems like a very major, significant character flaw if you have no patience, if you're impatient, right? Well, what if you go all the way to the other extreme? What if you have too much patience, right? What if you're way too patient? Is it possible to be too patient? Yeah, it probably is. So, for example, let's say um, uh, we have we've adopted a couple of rescue cats recently, and um, let's say one of them is hungry, and I say, well, I'm just going to be patient. I want this cat to be patient, right? Is it possible to have too much patience? Sure, because then starvation might result, right? So, okay, we don't have too much patience. Obviously, something needs to get done at some point, right? We can't. Too much patience might be considered procrastination, right? Oh, you may have heard one of them meowing just now. So we don't want to have too little patience. We don't want to have too much patience. We want to be at that sweet spot right in the middle, right? So this is sometimes called the golden mean, right? The golden average between two extremes, that sweet spot between the vices. And so that's kind of how one can locate the virtues, right? So another classic example is how we locate courage, how we identify courage as a virtue. We can again look at extremes. Let's imagine that there is some kind of terrible situation where people's lives are at stake and really something needs to be done. Let's say there is somebody who is, God forbid, an active shooter who comes in and you have several options. One of the things you could do if you don't have any courage at all, what might you do? You might just kind of run off and save yourself and not really worry about anybody else, right? That's if you have no courage, right? If you are a coward, effectively, the vice of cowardice. What if you have too much courage? Is that possible to have too much courage? Let's say there's the active shooter coming through the hall, and you just run at the person heroically, and you want to block all the bullets with your body. Well, it's not, it's way too much courage. It's so much courage that it starts to look like foolishness, right? Because you're just going to probably get killed very quickly. And yeah, I guess you were a hero. Maybe you blocked a few bullets, but maybe the shooter's just going to sort of continue after, okay. I know this is a very morbid way of thinking about this, but a classic example that Aristotle used is a soldier who is in battle, right? So a soldier in battle, if he doesn't have any courage, he's just going to be a coward, and he's going to shrink back, and he won't fulfill his responsibility as a soldier. Well, what if he has too much courage, right? Then he'll run out in front of everybody else, and he'll just come out with guns blazing or sword flailing, and may end up um, getting ahead of the pack, getting ahead of his troops, and puts himself at significant risk and probably just get killed very quickly, right? Because he'll just enter this horde of enemy. All right, so you get a sense of where it is between those two extremes, between cowardice and foolishness, or foolhardiness, is courage. It's at that sweet spot. That's how Aristotle identified the virtues. Okay, now I want you to pause the video one more time, and I'd like for you to think of go back to the list of virtues that you had listed, and maybe write a few sentences that describe what the extremes look like, right? So whatever the virtue is, think about the extremes. If you don't have enough of it, or if you have too much of it, right? If you think about those extremes, and write a few sentences about that, right? Okay, and pause. And we're back, right? I don't want to have too much patience there, otherwise we never really get through this video. Okay, so if you may have come up with certain kinds of extremes on this spectrum for the different virtues that you identified in the first part of the video. So I hope this is a helpful overview and basic introduction to virtue ethics, right? So this idea that we identify virtuous behavior, we identify moral behavior, ethical behavior, not necessarily by your adherence to laws or principles or rules, but rather by your character, by your personality, whether you harbor and cultivate these character traits. One thing else that is valuable to mention here is that like other forms of goodness, this is actually an area in which, many areas in which human beings can actually improve. We can grow in our virtues, right, by various forms of exercise. It's very similar to exercise, actually, right? So it's a some people refer to it, again, I used this word earlier, as a cultivation, right? Almost like it's a garden that you're growing. And so virtue can be understood that way. And I might ask you to reflect also, not necessarily in writing if you don't want, but reflect on how it is that one might go about developing virtue, becoming a more virtuous person in all the different ways that you might have discussed and that we might discuss, right? So reflect on that, and I look forward to reading what you responded to the various prompts in this video in the discussion forum, and I'll look forward to interacting with you at some point in the future. I will certainly alert you when I am able to connect a little bit better and do these live streams again. Thanks, and hope you enjoyed it.